Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. As always, I'm your host, Arif, and I'm joined by
TK, the leadership troublemaker.
Thank you, everyone, once again for joining us on this episode. We've got plenty to talk about. I think it's going to be an interesting topic to explore. So, TK, why don't you introduce our topic for our listeners today?
Well, so what's been happening for us is, for the last 3 years, we had a great privilege of helping an international, multinational company in training their young leaders.
Yeah.
Like, people born in the 90s, late 90s, early nullies. I don't know that's the way it's called, but it is. And I'm not a huge fan of labels, but they're collectively called Generation Z.
Yes.
So I just wanted to talk about, there's nearly 300 people that we've helped develop into hopefully great leaders, and we've seen their careers flourish over the years, and we have some experiences and stories to tell about, the leadership style of people coming in as leaders from this particular generation.
Yeah, and probably also, I guess, we're talking about what it means to lead those individuals from that generation as well, isn't it? There's two sides.
Indeed, we can actually start with that because I think, that's where you want to start, because the way anyone is being led is influencing their style of leadership, right?
Yeah.
So whatever we expect leaders to have for ourselves will then later on, when we are being leaders ourselves, obviously emanate from us.
And what do you think when it comes to, obviously, what we're here for, agile leadership? What are your thoughts from that perspective when you've been looking into this topic? And obviously, we'll go into it in more detail. What particular interests you or excites you in that regard?
Well, agile is the way of work of not even the present. It's actually not even the future. It's actually the present.
Yeah.
So one would say that you have to lead in an agile way if you want to lead the people of the future, or this is how the people of the future or of the current incoming leadership generation will lead. So it's interesting to see how these two leadership models and the expectations of the new incoming leaders are actually coalescing, and they are.
That is quite interesting. I'm sure we'll get into it in more detail throughout the episode, won't we? So,
yes, we will, right? Arif, I'm sure you, when we were training and developing leaders, I'm sure you have stories to tell, so we'll have plenty of opportunities to share them.
Yeah, let's do that. So where do we want to start the episode? What's the first kind of signpost that we want to head towards?
Well, I think the best thing to talk about is what have we seen people from this generation to actually expect, and what do they actually want, and what they are looking for in the leaders that they look up to lead them. So, Arif, from your perspective, what have you seen? What's the most important thing, like where we were working and are still working with these wonderful people? What do you see them looking for from us, for instance, when we're leading them?
I think there's definitely there's a lot of passion in what they want to do. They're very keen to progress very fast in their careers. That's what we've seen from some of the people we've been working with, definitely. And they want a lot of the information and want to learn and absorb a lot of the knowledge as quickly as possible in order that they can progress to wherever they want to get to next in their careers. I've noticed that a lot. That's quite a trend that I've seen, especially with the client we've been working with. And look, that's not a generalization we can make across this kind of generation, can we, TK? This is just some anecdotal, I suppose, evidence from what we've seen. But I've definitely seen that. I've definitely been aware of it, and I can definitely talk about that, which is, there's a desire to want to push ahead, get ahead as quickly as possible, and, have access to all the resources, whether it's knowledge, information, colleagues, peers, in order to, get where they want to get to in their careers. And I think there's something interesting on that point alone, looking back at my own early career, and maybe TK, you can share something on this, which is there was always for me anyway, this kind of view perspective. And I think a lot of my cohort, when I graduated and my first graduate role that I took on, that, we need to learn the ropes essentially and make sure we, get as broad as a knowledge as possible about the organization, the business, rotate around. And that was always the message that we were kind of pushed to as well in the business I was in, that, before you can even think about promotions and, career trajectories and things like that, you've got to get you got to get your feet wet a little bit and, make, I'll not say a name for yourself, but make sure that people are aware of what you're doing and, you've demonstrated your capabilities. And you've done that in a number of places before you can even think about perhaps, moving on to that next stage of your career. So anecdotally, I think I would say there is a shift in that regard. That's one thing I've definitely observed.
So that's a very good point, Arif, but also another point to talk about a possible bias, because, as long as we have called ourselves people, there were people that were young. And it's just important to have a distinction between young leaders or, people just coming into the workforce and this particular generation, which is obviously influenced by the particular time they're living and working in, right? So, for instance, obviously, right, if you're young, you're full of energy, you want to make a name for yourself. And I remember that myself when I was young, or a bit of a different generation. But also what's important is when you are young, chances are, as you've mentioned, Arif, you're coming from your education is still fresh in your memory, right? So the way your academia worked, it might be a similar expectation you have from the workplace, but that's actually very different. So one thing that, research says, and obviously as always, we'll have our sources in the podcast notes, is that there's a report, the Leveler report, and 42% of Gen Z would prefer to working for companies that align with their values rather than getting a bigger bigger paycheck. So that's quite interesting how purpose is important for the current generation. And do you think, Arif, it's unique, or is it something that you've seen before?
I don't know how unique it is, but what's interesting is from what you're quoting there in that report, that it is a significant portion of this so-called generation. Like it's, you would expect. I think this is where maybe I my critique of this perhaps a little bit is you'd expect that in any generational shift change, there'd always be people who are looking for roles and companies, organizations where value alignment is quite important, more than perhaps pay and what have you. And I think the other side of this, which is interesting given how economically the world is moving on right now.
Yeah.
And if we look at it, especially from a Western perspective, with cost of living rising and, for instance, housing, let's just take that as an example, right? Very unsecure. Here in the UK especially, we have lots of challenges with that. I would be very interested to know, how that breaks down, that number, because I would think that most young people nowadays are looking for secure, stable income. As much as they would like, I suppose, it's 42%, but as much as they would like a company that aligns with values and principles, that is important to them. I'm curious to know, is that how much of that really is the case when there are some, hygiene factors which need attending to, shall we say, for most people.
That's a very good point, Arif, in terms of how our socio-economic circumstances are shaping the expectations of a given generations in the workforce, right? So obviously there is different perspectives around the world. Different countries are in a different place in their economical, political, and overall cycles. But if you look for the Western perspective, you could say that the unemployment has been low for quite a while. So in effect, I'm not surprised that currently it's a bit easier or you can't have in your mind a position that, okay, it's easier to find a job, and thus you are looking for something that will give you purpose in your life. So possibly in the Western perspective, with lower unemployment, you could have that. But the other thing that you've hinted at is a second priority that they're taking, right? If you for instance, look at the US, the American Psychological Association suggests that especially when it comes to people, the older members of this generation born in the late 90s, they have a particular inclination towards finding, or they expect their leaders to really prioritize mental well-being, right? So they're looking for a job that basically can give them the stability, and is also looking for not having too much of a stressful or toxic atmosphere. That's also very important for these people. I'm just wondering, is there anything special about it, Arif?
I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting one, because when I was looking at that as well, it seems that comes from some studies which are suggesting that within this age group of 18 to 23-year-olds, stress is, I think, is hitting about a third of that age group are facing mental health challenges, which is worse now than it has ever been compared with other previous generations, whether you compare to millennials, Gen X, or baby boomers, etc. So there's something else going on here, which is mental health being a broader issue challenge for this generation, which is perhaps causing some of this. What you're seeing, what you're looking at there, TK, in terms of why they're looking for those type of employers who prioritize mental health and well-being more than perhaps previously.
So let's unpack that, right? You could say that the way I interpret that is, well, again, depends on what part of the world you're looking at. Obviously, some face existential difficulties. Some face, just growing up in wartime. Now, obviously, this will have a huge impact on any mental well-being. But if you look at, at the Western society, you would find that, especially the way I see it, and these people have, been raised with the internet or online services, social media existing throughout their lifetime, it seems like, life is just cranked up to 11 in a constant flow of media, constant flow of various dramas. And also, going back to what I said previously, as in low unemployment, there probably is a lower tolerance to toxic behavior at work. Whereas previously, maybe it was tolerated more, right? The expectation, the silent expectation was that your leader, your boss, is a bit toxic. I'm not saying shouting at you and such. And now it's no longer tolerated, isn't it?
No, I suppose not. I think there's other factors.
That's a good thing, I guess.
We've got to think about here or recognize is that with this, for this generation, they've come through lockdown, perhaps maybe COVID-19.
Oh, yes.
And that probably has had a huge impact in job seeking, alongside mental health as well. Worries and concerns about long-term employment. We mentioned the economic situation, but I think we can also look at, this generation being much more aware to social issues as well. I know we may come on to that, but I was just thinking about, who's leading the charge when it comes to, really taking forward the conversation about climate change, for instance, right? That tends to come. It tends to be younger voices who are far more passionate and concerned and worried than perhaps the older generation, because they're thinking about, well, what's going to happen when I grow up? What's going to happen when I want to start a family or when I have children? Are we going to have the same kind of planet to look forward to that my parents and my grandparents have already benefited from? Right now, they're coming towards the twilight years. So all these worries, concerns, I think, obviously swirl into this mix of, okay, I need to think about different things when I'm looking for an employer. I need to worry about more broader issues, not just my own, perhaps when I'm looking for employment. It's fascinating to think of it like that, I suppose.
Yes, it is, right? And, when you actually, maybe one thing we've put in the notes is there's one nice graph with all the generations. You can see all the cohorts. And, the Generation Z, also called Zoomers, are actually, definitely starting their work, maybe even becoming leaders, and actually thinking about starting their own families now. The next generation is the one growing up. So these people are actually now discovering that they have the more of an agency in the world, right? So definitely, when it comes to social issues, diversity and inclusivity, plus representing the varied political opinions or the political variety, is something that is now available. Overall, yeah, go ahead.
No. So the question I suppose I'm thinking about, T, we talked about all these various aspects about purpose, prioritizing mental well-being, D&I. What does that mean from a leadership point of view? How are we able to help this generation or signpost it? So here are the type of leaders that really are worrying about this, or organizations. I mean, what are the things that they need to look for?
So the way I interpret all that, right, and working with young people or up and coming leaders from this generation, one thing I can understand is, as always, the authenticity. So sometimes it can be difficult. We'll actually talk about the difficulties of leading these wonderful people, but they now have their voice and they're more demanding. So we need to have, especially strong leaders, being able to understand, not get frustrated, and work with people that have a stronger voice, even if they're not being leaders themselves. Possibly the people that from previous generations were a bit more timid when it comes to their attitude towards leaders. You know me, Arif, I'm not definitely timid. I think, it's important to be a truth teller. But now I maybe get to eat my own dog food, as in people that really speak their mind and people that demand things which they're entitled to. Absolutely, right? We should have all these things: purpose, mental and well-being, plus diversity, inclusivity, and variety of views. So there you go, right? You just have to have leaders that can understand that, okay, now people will hold me accountable.
Okay, sounds good. So more on this then, in terms of being led and what this generation perhaps is looking for a bit more. Are there any particular challenges perhaps that organizations need to be aware of, or perhaps considerations that they need to make when working or employing folks from this generation? What are your thoughts there, TK?
I think so, and we've prepared some. We have sources that tell us that, and I've prepared 3. So obviously, when it comes to this generation, they grew up with access to the internet, right? So this mode of communication shaped the way they communicate. It's interesting because for them, reaching out anyone at any time, at any place of the globe, is quite natural, and it's at their fingertips. And it always has been like that throughout their life. So one needs to understand that they might prefer different ways of communication, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I think there is something with this growing up in this very always-on digital environment that perhaps maybe means that they are also wired to, or not say wired, that's probably maybe a bit unfair, but maybe more accustomed to that always-on communication approach. And I think perhaps more so in terms of asynchronous, as in, it doesn't have to be,
Indeed, yeah.
Me, talking on over the phone with you, but messaging in whatever format via videos, clips, message, direct message, whatever social media platforms you want to think about, right? So there's probably a lot of asynchronous communication that they are more accustomed to than perhaps I was maybe growing up. I don't know. Maybe I don't know how true that is, but I'm just
well, we have an example, Arif.
Yeah,
I remember when we the program we were leading, we needed to find a best way of communicating with them long term, with the members of the program. So you were the one that put a wonderful idea of a bulletin in place. And yet, despite the fact that you and I thought it's like the most brilliant idea ever, it wasn't well received. So I'm wondering, why do you think it might have been the case?
I don't know. It's a good question. So just for context, it was a asynchronous method of communication that we thought, okay, well, we'll blast out this kind of on the tool that we're using. We'll blast out this kind of comms once a week or once every 2 weeks, whatever, with an update of here's what's been happening. Here's some things to think about, some tips and hints and whatever, and here's how you can get in touch with us if you need some help. And we got some responses, but on the whole, I think it was a case of not that much interaction with it. But maybe I put it down to just distractions. There are just far too many distractions, and that's just the case, I think, generally speaking, not just for them as a cohort that we were working with, but they were, they got their day job. They've got this program that we were running on the side. They've got their personal lives. They've got flexible working going on in many cases where, perhaps they work from home some days or they work in the office and so on and so forth. So I think there's just a lot going on, and maybe they knew what they needed to prioritize for their health well-being, and on occasion, this wasn't the priority for them.
And I think now that I've explored that, and for instance, for this program, we've changed it. But that's another thing that research shows is a bit of a challenge for leading these wonderful people, which is short attention spans. Essentially, as you say, Arif, there's so much distraction going on. But I guess for these people, they just evolved and got used to it. Right? There's just so much, and it's just difficult to get it. So instead of, I guess the bulletins might still be there, but we've prepared a reference for them. So even if they get distracted, even if they forget, we've prepared a very easily accessible reference book that they can quickly navigate and find any information they need, right? So it's just important when you are leading people of this generation to know that you can't have things in separate places. It's just when a person like this thinks, they just need to be able to access it and not have it in the moment. I think what you're saying, right? Yeah.
TK, is you've got to have multiple routes to access the information.
Yeah.
That is that, and so provide information.
And it can't be fleeting, right? It can't be volatile.
No, provide information or communicate in a way that they can access it when they want, at their convenience, in a way that suits them. That's what it boils down to. I think that's the learning.
What it boils proper asynchronous, right? And it's easy accessible.
If you're not going to join a call, okay, then here's the information, or here's a recording, and it's your responsibility, kind of thing. Or if you're not going to read this bulletin, then look at this document and what have you. Now, this is a challenge for a lot of organizations, I'm guessing, and a lot of leaders. Maybe that's not what they want. And going back to last week's episode, we were talking about remote work and flexible working. There's a connection there for me, which is, the cultural gap between many leaders of organizations, and I'm talking about executive board, senior level, who are running the business or the organization, culturally are of a different generation, perhaps, to many of the workforce coming into the organization. And so there's a big gap in expectations and management styles and how they see management, being effective for them, right? So from that senior level, it's past, no, we need to see you, we need to be able to measure you, we need to be able to, actually witness what's going on. Whereas for this young generation, it's probably more about, look, trust me to get the job done. I'll do what I need to do. You provide everything in the right place and what have you, and I'll get cracking. I'll be productive. There's something there, I think, that probably it needs further exploration, perhaps, for a lot of these organizations.
And I think, people think it's a challenge that these wonderful young people have a preference for autonomy instead of just being directly told what to do. And I don't think it's a challenge at all. I think this is an amazing thing for a true agile leader, because you yourself, leading in this way, can have people that, can fully realize their potential, being led in an agile way, right? Trusting, making sure that they're supported, but on the other hand, working with value-driven and mission-driven objectives.
Yeah, no, that works obviously in terms of what we're promoting with agile leadership, as you said, TK. It works quite well, and I think it does remove some of the pressure off leaders who perhaps. But there, I think there's an interesting thing going on, a dynamic where there's this probably tension for many leaders who are not familiar, or no, familiar is not the right word. I think who are not used to, or who are not necessarily expecting to lead in this way, when they're confronted with, very confident, passionate, smart young people who want to progress really well, but on their own terms, and then well, hold on, I'm meant to dictate to you what needs to happen here. I'm going to set the boundaries. And there's this challenge of, no, actually, can we design our own boundaries and we'll get the work done as we see fit. So that needs to gel together. That needs to somehow come together in a way that can work for the organization and for the workforce. I think that's something that probably, I don't know if we're talking about that today, TK, but and from an agile point of view, or an agile leadership point of view, it's about what levels of delegation are comfortable for the organization as well. That's another dimension here. We're talking a lot about the workforce. We're talking a lot about leaders. But I think we've got to not forget that there's an organizational responsibility as well in terms of what the organization expects, what it delivers, what value it holds in terms of the outcomes it looks for, all of that stuff. And there's got to be, those three have got to come into the picture somehow.
They do, right? But it also shows which organizations, if this research stays very relevant, will be able to get the maximum value from these wonderful young people.
Well, let's take a pause there, TK, and come back after the break where we'll continue talking about more on this fascinating topic. If you've been enjoying our Leading with Agility podcast, then why not join us to discuss every episode Fridays at 9 a.m. London time on our LinkedIn page. That's right. Link is in our episode description. Head over there and click it on 9 a.m. London time to join us for an audio session where TK and I will be talking about our latest episode. See you there. Welcome back. And before the break, we were talking about how leadership needs to take into account Generation Z employees in the workplace. So TK, where are we taking the conversation next?
Maybe looking at the other side of the equation, which is, what if you actually have a Gen Z leader? What can you expect from them? How the Gen Z young people will actually lead the world going forward? So Arif, what have you observed for them actually leading?
Well, I think you connected some of it already at the start when you talked about what they're looking for from leaders. And we mentioned that purpose element, values, being aligned, etc. And I think going back to what I was saying as well in terms of being much more aware and conscious of wider political, social, environmental, I suppose, issues that concern them and their generation, that is all going to come into how they want to lead. And I think if you just look, let's just put the world of work to one side. And if we look at politics just for a moment, just hold your horses, CK, but just looking at politics, this whole so-called culture wars that we have nowadays, right? With so-called wokeism and progressive politics versus what's probably more established and institutional. There is a huge gap there, generational gap and understanding gap of what younger people want to see versus what the traditional institutionalized political leadership want to maintain. So that I think is you're going to see that more and more in the workplace now, and that will reflect in terms of the leadership style of these individuals who then take on that mantle of leadership themselves. So we're looking at becoming more, focused around what's the right thing to do, led by a clear purpose. Are we doing something that's beneficial? And I think we've, in some ways, touched on this in other episodes. We've talked about ethics. We've talked about courage. We've talked about evidence-based management. We're talking about all of these things. I think they all come in a little bit, and I think I'm quite excited to see how this generation pick all of that up more intuitively than you might expect, and then run with it and actually form a completely brand new form of leadership that I think will be exciting to see how it takes the world forward.
And, we'll talk about it in this episode still. But what I find and what I've seen, maybe outside of this purpose-driven perspective of leadership is they're quite entrepreneurial. As in, one is they're not afraid to take risks.
That's true.
But also knowing that, look, right, Arif, the previous generations had jobs for life. Nowadays, it's like 2-3 years, and you hope. And maybe these people, these leaders know that, maybe having a salaried position, even though it offers security, it's not the be-all, end-all. Maybe they can find and start their own something, right? As people say, invent their own job. All these startups and everything is a consequence of that. So I think that also plays a big part, that you will have these leaders being actually entrepreneurial. And it's an interesting thing, first of all, to contrast what you said about security, how the social and economic conditions can change. Maybe the next generation, I think Y, or we have a nice graph, Generation Alpha, in the early 2010s, they were born and, obviously coming into adulthood soon, are dealing with that, but also how these kinds of leaders would deal with older, more established employees that actually require more stability. So that's an interesting situation brewing there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that you're making some good points. And then I think moving forward, what else are we looking at? We've got other things around. I mentioned the social environmental stuff. I don't know if you want to touch on that. And I think, well, I'll start there. I think there's definitely a greater awareness, passion, and activism around that kind of topic. And I've already mentioned.
Clearly, we can see that.
Yeah, I think I mentioned why earlier on. What will that mean for, I think, organizations going forward is fascinating. And I think if we look at legacy organizations, companies who are, let's just, for argument's sake, energy sector, right? What happens when we have a younger leadership over time coming in and taking on positions of influence, control, authority, turning those ships around into something that are going to be more beneficial for the world, perhaps? Or are we seeing more of what they call, I think that the colloquial term is direct activism, isn't it? So it's more like, protesting outside of these organizations' headquarters and demanding change from outside. Or I think there's another aspect. Well, sorry, just another one on that. There's also investor activism as well, where you've got groups who then buy shares and get a seat at board meetings and then use that as a position to voice and demand change within an organization. So just a slight diversion, but yeah. So what I'm trying to say, I think, sorry, to summarize, is there is going to be a huge shift. I think we'll come to see over the next couple of years, 5-10 years, maybe longer, where I think as this generation rises into those positions, we will see different directions being taken. Hopefully not too late for the planet, but maybe long overdue, perhaps.
Maybe, Arif, and I don't want to provide a contrary point for the sake of it, there is also a chance that they get institutionalized, by which I mean not being inducted into a facility, but because of their life perspective and age naturally progressing, their life situation changes, families, then you've got, schooling of kids, then you've got mortgages and so on and so forth. Do you think they will change significantly, or do you think the values will still stay?
Who knows?
Yeah.
That's a big conundrum. I mean, I think it's too early to tell, isn't it? And I think that's going to be the biggest test. I think we can all talk from our own examples, and we've seen that. That this happens in life. As we age, our views and values do change. That happens as we for example, get married, or we have families, or our life stage moves to another, moves on. I think values, what's important, that does definitely change, and that does happen for many people. I think that's just a fact of life. What's interesting is I think we're seeing far more urgency for things or demands being made that things need to be different from this generation than maybe we saw in previous ones. But look, I defer to older colleagues on that because I'm too young to even I'd like to think I'm too young to opine on that effectively enough, because I wasn't around in the 60s, 70s, for example, right? Or 50, whatever generation we're talking about, and what were the major shifts going on there? And perhaps the younger generations of that time were doing the things that we're talking about and we're seeing of Gen Z now. So yeah, I'm talking myself out of the whole argument as well a little bit here.
Because it's a difficult one, Arif.
Really
but
difficult.
One thing we need to notice is the fact that we shouldn't confuse just young people with this particular generation.
Sure.
Because this is like an ongoing life cycle that a human has a life. So this is an ongoing bias that we will have because of the current age that this generation is in versus the distinctive features of our current reality, right? So we've got situations like the internet, the problems with our environment, all kinds of like the political polarization, the globalization, and maybe a keener look or more of a I would say understanding and appreciation of underprivileged groups and so on, right? So diversity there. So I think this is interesting. But Arif, I'm just wondering what, you say yourselves being young, but, gray beards and bald spots,
Thanks,
speaking
TK.
from experience. Well, there you go, right? What you're going to do. We're not getting any younger. But I was wondering, for us old chestnuts,
Yes.
what can we learn from them?
Well, I think that's a good point. There's a lot to learn, and I think you leaders, if you're listening, it'd be remiss of you to not exploit this talent and support them in their ability to accelerate into the organization and get to those positions of influence as quickly as possible. I think their energy, their desire to see change, the urgency by which they operate, I think all things are admirable qualities. I think from a leadership point of view, we've talked about how it works quite well from when it comes to agile leadership, how perhaps their desire to be more value-based, purpose-driven, and also seeing wanting a desire for more autonomy in the workplace, all fit really well with what we talk about when we talk about agile leadership. So I think that's all really great stuff that I think from organizations and from leaders, you've got plenty of good qualities there that you need to leverage and take into account when it comes to building your teams, building your organization for the future.
And I'm personally taking ambition as something I would like to learn and take away from working with these wonderful young people. What I'm also taking is, not taking no for an answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might be not taking no from a consultant that tells you, hey, look, if you do that, you will probably not succeed. And they don't often care.
Yeah.
And, fine, they do fail, not accepting wisdom, but also they learn a lot, I guess.
They do. And it's interesting because we did talk about sharing stories and stuff. And I think one of the things I've admired working with this cohort of young leaders that we have is they demonstrate a lot of resilience. At the same time, they do have worries and anxieties as well. This is really interesting. So one of the leaders, one of the young people I worked with last year, really resilient in, firstly, English not being her second language, working with an international team that we'd put together, which she was part of, trying to solve a complex problem. And despite English not being a first language, she showed immense resilience to, go ahead, do her best, and actually help her team pivot, change direction, and deliver on some really awesome work through the way that we'd set up for them. And I think they came top in the in the group. So I think we've seen that a lot. But at the same time, they want the reassurance. They want to be told that everything is fine, everything's okay, or they want reassurance that everything's fine, is okay, they're being looked after and what have you. But when you do provide that and you do trust them, they can be quite resilient and, as you said, maybe a bit stubborn in trying to achieve their goals. So
that's true, but also very purpose-driven and outspoken.
Yes.
Had a completely opposite situation of, let's say, top educated in one of the famous British universities, young person. And, I took special care because this person missed some of the training. So I met with them and briefed them on what would happen, the parts of the training they missed because they were sick. And they clearly said to me, "Oh, that's great. I understand that. But, I don't think this particular thing that this team is working on will help my career. So I'm not really going to put much effort into it."
Wow.
And, I won't bother with it. And I thought, well, it's
quite a brazen to kind of openly admit that, isn't it? Say, "Oh, I'm not interested in the topic of the team I'm assigned to."
Yes, they admitted that. And I thought to myself, well, maybe this is actually quite a mature decision, right?
Yeah.
That, but they weren't causing trouble. They collaborated, obviously not given all their energy in. But on the other hand, I respect that they know what they want. They have their purpose. And this wasn't on their career map, quite profound. So they still had a good time without over-extraining themselves on this particular thing, and they invested the effort somewhere else. And yet, this is sometimes something many people should learn from. Even if it sounds brazen, Arif, which it does, many people waste their time with things that aren't valuable to their own life's mission.
Yeah, that's true. Great. Well, I think we've come to the end of today's episode, TK. It's been a fascinating conversation, touring our way through the the world of Generation Z and things that they're looking for in the workplace today, and definitely some thoughts for our leaders listening in terms of what they need to be doing to really look after this generation and give them the best possible chance of succeeding in the workplace.
And if you're in a leadership development space, or you are, a people person, a people manager, these are the leaders that will lead your organization. And what is it that you need to do to have a great organization for them, and how you need to help them develop.
That's right. Well, with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to all of you for the time you've spent listening to us. We hope you've enjoyed the episode as always. And don't forget to rate or like the episode or our podcast on your favorite podcast player. And if you haven't already, do subscribe as well. Until next time,
Yes,
we shall see you on that next episode of Leading with Agility.